In the early 17th century, the Dutch Republic was, widely regarded as a beacon of liberty in Europe. It was a place where people flocked to escape persecution, a society built on these new ideas of freedom, tolerance, and self-governance. Having fought for 80 long years to win their independence from the Spanish Empire, the Dutch really cherished their hard-won sovereignty. They saw themselves as champions of freedom, a small nation that had stood up to a mighty empire and actually prevailed. This self-image was central to their national identity. They were not like the Spanish or the Portuguese, whose empires were built on conquest and subjugation, or so they told themselves. This narrative of a plucky, freedom-loving people became the foundational myth of the Dutch Golden Age, a time of, incredible wealth, scientific discovery, and artistic genius. Yet, beyond the shores of Europe, a very different story was unfolding. The same ships that carried Dutch ideals of liberty across the seas also carried the instruments of bondage. The Dutch West India Company, chartered in 1621, was the engine of a new and brutal form of Dutch expansion. While the Dutch celebrated their freedom at home, the WIC was building an overseas empire that would be utterly dependent on the enslavement of others. This stark contradiction lies at the very heart of the Dutch story. The wealth that funded the magnificent canal houses of Amsterdam and the masterpieces of Rembrandt and Vermeer was, in fact, inextricably linked to the suffering of millions of Africans. The Dutch Republic was a paradox, a nation that championed liberty for some while systematically denying it to countless others. This hypocrisy was not a hidden secret. It was a fundamental component of the Dutch colonial enterprise. The WSE was a commercial entity driven by a single-minded pursuit of profit, and it quickly determined that the most profitable commodity of all was human beings. The company's directors, the powerful Heren Negentien, or Lords 19, made cold-hearted calculations about the trade in enslaved people. They saw it not as a moral crime, but as a necessary business strategy to compete with their European rivals. The Dutch entered the Atlantic slave trade with a kind of ruthless efficiency, transforming it into a highly organized and industrialized system. Their involvement would forever tarnish their golden age, revealing the dark and violent foundations upon which their prosperity was built. The story of the Dutch slave trade is, therefore, the story of a profound and troubling duality. It is the story of a nation that simultaneously held up the ideals of freedom and became one of the world's most prolific traffickers of human lives. The canals of Amsterdam, so often seen as symbols of Dutch ingenuity and success, were also channels through which the profits of slavery flowed, enriching the nation while financing the misery of others. To understand this period is to confront this uncomfortable truth that the Dutch Empire of Trade and the Dutch Republic of Freedom were two sides of the same coin, one built upon the brutal exploitation that the other claimed to despise. This legacy is not a footnote to Dutch history, it is central to it. The year 1637 marked a pivotal moment in the history of the Atlantic slave trade. In that year, the Dutch West India Company set its sights on a formidable prize, São Jorge da Mina, or Elmina Castle. Located on the coast of modern-day Ghana, this fortress was the oldest and most important European trading post in West Africa. It had been built by the Portuguese in 1482, a stone behemoth designed to dominate the trade in gold and, increasingly, in enslaved people. For the Dutch, capturing Elmina was not just about seizing a strategic asset. It was about supplanting their Portuguese rivals and gaining a decisive foothold in the lucrative and brutal business of human trafficking. The fortress was the key to controlling the region's commerce. The Dutch assault was honestly, meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed. After a previous failed attempt, a WIC fleet arrived with a force of several hundred soldiers. They did not attack the castle's sea-facing walls, which were heavily fortified. Instead, they landed their troops and dragged their cannons to the top of a nearby hill that overlooked the fortress. From this superior position, they bombarded the castle into submission. The Portuguese commander, realizing his position was hopeless, surrendered after just a few days of fighting. The Dutch flag was raised over Elmina, signaling a seismic shift in the balance of power on the Gold Coast. The castle, once the heart of the Portuguese slave trade, would now become the headquarters of the Dutch West India Company in Africa. Under Dutch control, Elmina Castle was transformed into a highly efficient hub for the slave trade. The Dutch expanded and reinforced the fortress, adding new bastions and strengthening its defenses. But the most sinister modifications happened within its walls. They enlarged the dungeons, creating dark, airless cells where thousands of captive Africans would be imprisoned. Men, women, and children, captured in the interior and marched to the coast, were held in these horrific conditions for weeks or even months. They were branded with the W-shaped mark of the W-ick, a symbol that stripped them of their names and identities, reducing them to mere property. The castle that had once been a center for gold trading became, above all, a place of immense human suffering. For the countless Africans forced through its gates, Elmina was the point of no return. It was the last piece of their homeland they would ever see. From its dungeons, they were led through a narrow, dark passage known as the Door of No Return, which opened directly onto the sea. There they were forced into small boats and ferried out to the massive slave ships waiting at anchor. The sight of the fortress from the ocean, a symbol of European power and African subjugation, would be their final haunting memory of their continent. The capture of Elmina in 1637 was not just a military victory for the Dutch. It was the moment they committed themselves fully to the industrial-scale enslavement of human beings, a legacy forever etched into the stones of that terrible place. The seizure of Elmina Castle was not an isolated event. It was the cornerstone of a much larger strategy. The Dutch West India Company understood that to dominate the slave trade, it needed more than just a single headquarters. It needed a network of control, a chain of fortified trading posts that would stretch along the West African coastline. This would allow the company to monopolize trade, shut out its European competitors, and ensure a steady supply of captive Africans for its plantations in the Americas. The WIC methodically began to build this network, either by conquering existing Portuguese forts or by constructing new ones. This chain of fortresses became the physical infrastructure of the Dutch slave trading empire in Africa. Over the following decades, the Dutch flag was raised over numerous forts along what was then known as the Gold Coast. Places like Fort Nassau, Fort Orange, and Fort Amsterdam became crucial links in this deadly chain. Each fort served as a fortified warehouse, a military garrison, and a prison. WIC's officials lived in relative comfort in the upper levels, conducting business and managing the trade in gold, ivory, and human beings. Below them, in the squalid dungeons, thousands of captives were held. These forts allowed the WIC to forge alliances with local African leaders, trading European goods like textiles, guns, and alcohol in exchange for people captured in wars and raids in the interior. This created a vicious cycle, as the availability of firearms fueled further conflicts, generating even more captives for the trade. The presence of this network of forts fundamentally altered the political and economic landscape of West Africa. The WIC did not rule over vast territories. Instead, it controlled the coast, the gateway to the Atlantic world. This gave the company immense power to dictate the terms of trade. Any African kingdom or European rival who wished to trade in the region had to contend with the Dutch military presence. The forts stood as menacing symbols of the WIC's authority, their cannons pointing both out to sea to ward off other European ships and inland to intimidate local populations. This strategic control ensured that the Dutch could maintain their dominance over the most profitable sections of the coastline for nearly 2 centuries. Life within these coastal forts was a microcosm of the colonial world, marked by stark hierarchies and brutal realities.
At the top were the Dutch governors and merchants, who often enriched themselves personally from the trade. Below them were the soldiers, artisans, and lower-ranking employees of the company. The forts also had a population of local people, including the so-called castle slaves, who performed domestic and manual labor within the fortress walls. And at the very bottom, in the darkest dungeons, were the thousands of captive Africans awaiting their forced journey across the Atlantic. This network of forts was the machine that processed human lives, a cold and calculated system designed for maximum profit at the cost of immeasurable human despair.
Just as Elmina Castle was the center of the Dutch slave trade in Africa, the island of Curaçao became its indispensable counterpart in the Americas. The Dutch captured this small, arid island from the Spanish in 1634. At first glance, it seemed, honestly, an unlikely prize. It lacked the fertile soil for large-scale sugar plantations that made islands like Barbados or Jamaica so valuable. However, the Dutch West India Company recognized its true potential. Curaçao possessed a magnificent natural deep-water harbor, perfectly sheltered and easily defended. Its strategic location, just off the coast of Spanish-controlled South America, made it the ideal transit point and distribution center for the entire Caribbean. It was destined to become the region's premier slave depot. Under the Wick, Willemstad, Curaçao's capital, was transformed into a bustling hub of commerce. But its most important trade was in human beings. Slave ships, having survived the horrific Middle Passage from West Africa, would arrive at the island's harbor. The surviving Africans, emaciated, sick, and traumatized from the voyage, were herded off the ships and into large holding pens or slave depots. Here, they were subjected to a process known as seasoning. They were fed just enough to make them appear healthier and more appealing to potential buyers. Doctors would inspect them, and their bodies were often oiled to hide the scars, sores, and wounds from their journey. This was a purely commercial exercise, designed to fatten up the product before it was taken to market. From Curaçao, the WIC organized the sale and distribution of enslaved people throughout the New World. The island became a massive marketplace where planters, merchants, and agents from across the Caribbean and the American mainland came to purchase human labor. Spanish, French, English, and Portuguese colonists all flocked to Curaçao, knowing they could find a steady and well-organized supply of captives. The WIC's officials became expert slave merchants, sorting people by age, gender, and perceived physical strength to maximize their sale price. Families who had managed to survive the Middle Passage together were now torn apart permanently, sold off to different owners, and sent to different colonies, never to see each other again. The efficiency of the Curaçao slave market was a key reason for the Dutch success in the Atlantic slave trade. The island functioned as a massive, brutal sorting house. By centralizing the trade in one location, the WIC could control prices and manage logistics on an unprecedented scale. The profits generated from this human marketplace were immense, flowing back to the company's investors in Amsterdam. While the island itself was not a major plantation colony, its entire economy was built upon the buying and selling of human lives. The calm, blue waters of its harbor, which today attract tourists, were once the final destination for hundreds of slave ships and the site of immeasurable trauma and loss for hundreds of thousands of Africans. The Dutch West India Company's ambition was not limited to supplying its own colonies with enslaved labor. The company's directors saw a far greater commercial opportunity, becoming the primary slave traders for the entire Spanish Empire. The Spanish colonies in the Americas had an insatiable demand for labor to work in their silver mines and on their agricultural estates. However, Spain lacked the trading posts in Africa and, honestly, the maritime expertise to conduct its own large-scale slave trade. To solve this, the Spanish crown created the Asiento de Negros, a monopoly contract that granted a foreign merchant or government the exclusive right to supply its colonies with a set number of enslaved Africans per year. For any European power, winning the Asiento was the ultimate prize in the slave trade. For a significant period in the 17th century, the Dutch, through the WIC and its Curaçao hub, became the de facto holders of this grim contract. Even when they did not hold the official asiento, they were often the main subcontractors, using their extensive network and efficient operations to supply the Spanish traders who did. The WIC's ships would deliver thousands of captives to Curaçao, where they would be sold to Spanish agents, who then transported them to ports in Cartagena, modern-day Colombia, Veracruz in Mexico, and Portobello in Panama. The asiento was, in effect, a license to print money, a formal agreement that institutionalized the trade in human beings on a massive, international scale and made the WC an indispensable partner to the Spanish Empire. This business arrangement really highlights the cold, transnational nature of the slave trade. National rivalries were often set aside when profits were at stake. The Dutch, who had fought a bitter war for independence from Spain, had no moral qualms about becoming the primary suppliers of human chattel to their former masters. Business was business. The WIC's role as an international slave broker meant that Dutch ships were responsible for the suffering of people destined for plantations and mines across the entire hemisphere, not just in their own colonies. They were the middlemen of misery, the logistics experts in a global system of exploitation, connecting the supply of captives from Africa with the demand for labor in the Americas. The profits from the asiento and other international slave supplying contracts were staggering. This revenue stream was a crucial part of the WIC's business model, helping to offset the high costs and risks of its colonial ventures. The money flowed back to the Netherlands, enriching the company's shareholders and contributing to the wealth of the Dutch Golden Age. But this profit was directly proportional to the scale of human suffering it caused. Each shipment of people delivered under the asiento contract represented thousands of lives destroyed, lives captured in violence, packed into the hellish holds of ships, and sold into a lifetime of brutal, forced labor. The Asiento de Negros was not just a commercial contract, it was a state-sanctioned instrument of mass human trafficking. If Curaçao was the marketplace, then colonies like Suriname were the factory floor of the Dutch slave empire. Located on the northeastern coast of South America, Suriname was captured by the Dutch from the English in 1667. It soon became the jewel in the crown of the Dutch plantation colonies, a place where immense fortunes were made from the cultivation of sugar. But this wealth was built on a foundation of unimaginable cruelty. Suriname's sugar plantations were notorious throughout the Americas for their brutal labor regimes and the appalling conditions endured by the enslaved population. They were, in essence, death camps, where people were worked to death for profit. The life of an enslaved person on a Surinamese sugar plantation was a relentless cycle of back-breaking labor. The process of making sugar was arduous and dangerous, from planting and cutting the heavy sugarcane under a sweltering sun to feeding the cane into powerful, limb-crushing mills. The most perilous work took place in the boiling houses, where the cane juice was heated in a series of large copper kettles. Here, enslaved workers toiled in intense heat, exposed to the risk of horrific burns from splattering, boiling sugar. They worked from sunrise to sunset, and often through the night during the harvest season. Malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion were rampant. The average life expectancy for a newly arrived African on a Suriname sugar plantation was frighteningly short, often just a few years. The plantation system was maintained through a regime of systematic terror. Plantation owners and their overseers used extreme violence to enforce discipline and crush any hint of resistance. Floggings were a daily occurrence, and punishments for minor infractions were savage. Enslaved people were subjected to horrific forms of torture, including branding, mutilation, and elaborate methods of execution designed to intimidate the entire community. The legal system offered no protection. It was designed solely to uphold the master's absolute power over his human property. This constant threat of violence was intended to break the spirit of the enslaved, to erase their humanity and reduce them to compliant beasts of burden. Despite the constant influx of new captives from Africa,
The enslaved population in Suriname could not sustain itself. The death rate was so high and the birth rate so low that the plantations were in constant need of fresh laborers to replace those who had perished. This created a perpetual demand that fueled the WIC's slave trade. The immense profitability of sugar meant that planters found it more economical to work their enslaved laborers to death and purchase new ones than to improve conditions and allow for natural population growth. Suriname stands as one of the most extreme examples of the logic of chattel slavery, where human lives were entered into the ledgers as disposable assets, and profit was the only thing that mattered.
Faced with the soul-crushing brutality of the plantation system, enslaved Africans did not submit passively. They resisted in countless ways, from small, everyday acts of defiance, like working slowly, faking illness, or breaking tools, to more organized and violent forms of rebellion. However, one of the most significant and enduring forms of resistance in Suriname and across the Caribbean was marronage. The act of escaping from the plantations and forming independent communities in the remote, inaccessible interiors. These escapees, known as Maroons, represented a powerful rejection of the slave system and a constant threat to the colonial order. They were a living symbol of freedom just beyond the reach of the planters. In Suriname, the dense, unmapped rainforest provided the perfect refuge for those daring enough to escape. The Maroons used their knowledge of the environment, often combined with skills and traditions brought from Africa, to build new societies in the jungle. They established villages, cultivated crops, and created their own social and political structures, often blending different African cultures to form a new, unique identity. These communities were not peaceful utopias. They were warrior societies, forged in a constant struggle for survival. They had to be constantly vigilant against colonial militias, known as slave catchers, who were sent into the jungle to hunt them down and destroy their settlements. The Maroons did more than just hide. They actively fought back. From their hidden bases, Maroon warriors would launch raids on the plantations, a practice that served multiple purposes. They would free other enslaved people, gather weapons and supplies, and exact revenge on the planters who had brutalized them. These raids terrified the colonial population and destabilized the plantation economy. The Dutch colonial authorities waged a series of bloody and costly guerrilla wars against the Maroons for decades, but they were never able to fully defeat them. The Maroons' mastery of the terrain and their fierce determination to remain free made them a formidable enemy. Ultimately, the colonial government was forced to acknowledge its failure to crush the Maroon communities. In the latter half of the 18th century, the Dutch authorities signed several peace treaties with the largest Maroon groups, such as the Indiuka and the Saramaka. These treaties were remarkable documents. In them, the Dutch formally recognized the Maroons' freedom and granted them territorial autonomy in the interior. The Dutch West India Company and the broader Dutch economy reaped enormous profits from the Atlantic slave trade and the plantation system. For over 2 centuries, the trade in human beings and the products of their forced labor, sugar, coffee, cocoa, and cotton, generated immense wealth. This capital flowed into the Netherlands, financing the nation's banking system, its shipping industry, and its famed Golden Age culture. The grand mansions lining Amsterdam's canals, the lavish lifestyles of the merchant elite, and the funding for scientific and artistic endeavors were all deeply intertwined with the profits extracted from the suffering of enslaved Africans. From a purely economic perspective, the venture was, for a time, a resounding success for the Dutch Empire. However, this balance sheet of profit and loss looks grotesquely different when we account for the human cost. The Dutch are estimated to have transported over 500,000 African men, women, and children across the Atlantic. This number, staggering as it is, does not even begin to capture the full scale of the tragedy. It does not include the countless people who died during capture in Africa, on the forced marches to the coast, or while imprisoned in the dungeons of Elmina and other forts. Nor does it include the tens of thousands who perished during the horrific Middle Passage, their bodies thrown into the ocean. The mortality rate on Dutch slave ships was notoriously high, often exceeding 15 to 20% per voyage. Once in the Americas, the horror continued. On plantations in places like Suriname, the death toll was relentless. The brutal work, malnourishment, and rampant disease meant that the enslaved population was constantly dying out, only to be replenished by new arrivals from Africa. The system was designed to extract the maximum amount of labor from a person's body in the shortest possible time, treating human beings as disposable commodities. Beyond the physical death toll, there was the immeasurable psychological and cultural cost, the destruction of families, the erasure of identities, the loss of languages and traditions, and the deep generational trauma inflicted upon millions of people. When we place the financial profits alongside this colossal human cost, the moral calculation becomes undeniable. The wealth of the Dutch Golden Age was purchased with the lives and freedom of millions. The claim that the slave trade was simply a business of its time fails to confront the sheer scale of the violence and dehumanization it required. The system was not an unfortunate byproduct of commerce. It was a deliberate, calculated enterprise of mass human exploitation. No amount of profit, no number of magnificent paintings or grand buildings can ever balance the ledger against the price paid in human lives. The true cost of the Dutch slave trade was a debt of blood and suffering that can never be repaid. The story of the Dutch Republic is often told as a triumph of liberty. This was the nation that fought for its freedom from Spanish tyranny, creating a society that valued individual rights, religious tolerance, and republican ideals. Philosophers like Baruch Spinoza and René Descartes found refuge in the Netherlands, able to think and write in ways that were impossible elsewhere in Europe. The Dutch proudly contrasted their open society with the absolutist monarchies surrounding them. Their self-perception was that of a moral, enlightened people who had built a new kind of nation based on freedom. This narrative of Dutch exceptionalism has been a powerful force in shaping their national identity for centuries. Yet, this entire edifice of freedom stood alongside an imperial enterprise built on its polar opposite. The Dutch West India Company, operating with the full sanction of the Dutch state, perfected a system of human bondage that was as cruel and efficient as any in history. The same society that debated the nature of human freedom at home had no issue with classifying millions of Africans as property, as chattel to be bought, sold, and worked to death. This was not a secret known only to a few. It was an open and integral part of the national economy. The contradiction was glaring. How could a nation that so cherished its own liberty be so deeply invested in the enslavement of others? This hypocrisy was rationalized through the construction of racist ideologies. To justify the enslavement of Africans, European thinkers, including some Dutch intellectuals, began to develop theories that portrayed black people as inherently inferior, as less than human. They were depicted as savage, uncivilized, and naturally suited for servitude. This dehumanization was a necessary psychological and philosophical tool. It allowed the Dutch to resolve the profound moral contradiction at the heart of their society. By defining Africans as outside the circle of humanity to whom the principles of liberty applied, they could maintain their self-image as a free and enlightened people, while simultaneously profiting from the most brutal form of human exploitation. In the end, the legacy of the Dutch slave trade forces a radical re-evaluation of the Dutch Golden Age. It reveals that this celebrated period of prosperity and cultural achievement was inextricably linked to, and funded by, a system of profound violence and injustice.
The liberty celebrated in Amsterdam was a selective, racialized liberty, one that did not extend to the black bodies toiling on the sugar plantations of Suriname. The Dutch Empire did indeed make a great deal of money, but its moral and human cost was catastrophic. The dark legacy of the slave trade is not a separate colonial story. It is a central, unavoidable part of the history of the Netherlands itself, a permanent stain on its celebrated age of gold.